Winter had a way of silencing things. Men, machines, even memories. It pressed its cold palms against the earth and squeezed until every sound felt thin and brittle, like it might snap if someone breathed too hard. On the front lines, where broken trees stood like the ribs of a dead giant, even artillery seemed to echo longer than it should, drifting across the frozen fields as if searching for a place to land. But after each blast, there came a quiet so deep it felt personal, a quiet that reminded every soldier on both sides how small a man becomes when the world around him stops moving. Then from the stillness came the soft crunch of paws on snow. At first, no one paid attention. Men expected dangers, not distractions, but over the weeks they began to look for him, the little brown dog who wandered through trenches and across no man's land with the confidence of a creature who didn't understand the rules. He carried no flag, no uniform, no fear, just a tail that wagged like a metronome keeping time in a place where time had lost meaning. He had somehow become everyone's dog. Germans claimed he slept near their cookhouse because he preferred their stew. Allied POWs insisted he spent more time with them, learning tricks in exchange for crumbs of hard bread. Frontline soldiers swore he visited their foxholes each morning, checking on them like an officer doing rounds. In a world built out of mistrust, he trusted everyone, and that alone made him unforgettable. War had trained men to look for shadows, for silhouettes, for danger in every movement. Yet this small creature became the only thing that brought their shoulders down, their breath steady, their voices softer. He was the single warm pulse in a landscape carved from ice. There was a strange beauty in it, a contrast sharper than any barbed wire. While nations hurled hatred across borders and men learned to pull triggers before thinking, the most beloved being in miles of frozen misery was a dog who understood nothing of propaganda or flag or enemy. He simply walked where he wanted. And somehow that freedom made the soldiers feel human again. It reminded them that beneath the frost, beneath the layers of uniforms and commands, there still lived a part of them untouched by war's discipline of cruelty. They didn't know it then, but he had become the fragile thread holding two exhausted sides together, the quiet heartbeat inside a landscape that had forgotten how to listen. And soon they would learn how much that heartbeat meant, because war has a way of revealing the true value of things only when they go missing. It didn't take long for the dog to become more than a wandering curiosity. Little by little, he evolved into something no one had planned for, an unofficial ambassador in a landscape where ambassadors were supposed to wear medals, not mud. He moved between worlds with a freedom no soldier possessed, slipping under fences, weaving through trenches, and padding across frozen fields as if the war were nothing more than an inconvenient noise in the background of his day. The German guards were the first to claim him. They said he had a soldier's discipline. He showed up at the same time each morning, sat politely beside their cookhouse door, and accepted his scraps with a dignity that made the men laugh. They gave him a name, though the prisoners never learned it, and the guards swore he understood every word of their rough, affectionate German. But the Allied POWs told a different story. They insisted he preferred their company, especially after dark, when the guards grew tired and the camp settled into uneasy silence. The dog would slip under the lowest strand of barbed wire and trot up to the barracks, where he'd receive crumbs of stale bread and a few whispered commands. Within weeks, he could roll over, play dead, and salute like a tiny soldier, a trick that made even the hardest men blink back a smile. And then there were the frontline troops, the men who lived in mud and fear. They claimed he visited them more faithfully than their own supply lines. Soldiers in frost-bitten trenches said the dog arrived like a morning report,
tail high, trotting along the firing steps, sniffing helmets, nudging boots. Some men believed he brought luck. Others believed he was part ghost, part miracle, part reminder that life still had a pulse. But the most startling thing wasn't the dog himself, it was the way he made men look at each other. Across barbed wire, across rifle barrels, across the invisible lines drawn by nations and hatred, soldiers noticed something unsettling. The enemy smiled at him too. A German would bend down to scratch his ears, and an Allied prisoner watching from a distance would feel a strange, unfamiliar tug. Not fear, not anger, but recognition. A British pilot would feed him crumbs, and a German guard would watch from the gate, surprised how gentle the prisoner's hands looked in that moment. Propaganda had carved monstrous shapes into their minds, filling their imaginations with teeth and claws where ordinary men should have been. But the dog exposed a softer truth. If the enemy could kneel in snow and laugh at a wagging tail, then perhaps the enemy wasn't made of stone. Still, the warmth he inspired never fully dissolved the tension. Guns stayed loaded, orders stayed sharp, suspicion lingered like smoke. But somewhere beneath the iron layers of war, something small and fragile began to stir. Something the dog had carried with him from trench to camp, as casually as he carried the snow on his fur.
A reminder that humanity, though buried, was not dead. The morning he didn't return began like any other, cold enough to stiffen breath, quiet enough to make a man feel alone even in a crowded camp. Frost clung to the wire, turning each barb into a tiny shard of glass. The guards stamped their boots, muttering at the sky, and the POWs dragged themselves from their bunks, preparing for another day of the same gray routines that stitched one winter dawn to the next. No one noticed his absence at first. Dogs wander, men told themselves. He'll trot in when he's hungry. But then the cookhouse door stayed unvisited. The guards found their pockets still full of scraps. The usual bark, sharp, cheerful, impossible to ignore, never punctured the heavy silence. By mid-morning, someone finally said it aloud. "Where's the dog?" It was asked casually, but the question hung in the cold like a threat. A few Germans scanned the yard. A few prisoners looked up from their tasks. Most tried to keep their faces neutral, pretending not to feel the shift in the air. But the truth slid quietly into every mind. He never missed a morning. Within an hour, the guards checked the bunkers, peering into shadowed corners as if he might be curled beside an ammo crate. Prisoners whispered across work details, passing uneasy theories like smuggled notes. Someone claimed to have heard a yelp in the night. Someone else swore they saw tracks leading toward the woods. A third insisted he'd been taken by the other side, used as bait perhaps, or butchered for meat. No one wanted to believe any of it. Rumor, once started, moved faster than any soldier could walk. Soon the entire camp felt unsettled, as though a vital gear in its cruel machinery had slipped loose. Men who seldom spoke now murmured his name. Guards lingered near the fence longer than usual, staring out at the tree line with knitted brows. The commandant, normally unmoved by small disturbances, asked twice if anyone had seen the dog. War taught men to expect loss, to swallow it without complaint. But this was different. This was a crack in the daily pattern that had kept everyone sane. A creature no one officially owned had somehow become the camp's unspoken heartbeat, and that heartbeat had gone silent. By afternoon, unease thickened into suspicion. The Germans accused the prisoners of hiding him, convinced it was some petty rebellion. The prisoners fired back whispers that a guard must have shot him for wandering too close to the wire. And beneath those exchanges lurked a deeper fear shared by both sides. The minefields didn't care who loved him. A single misstep could have ended him quietly in the dark. The war machine relied on certainty,
strict schedules, harsh commands, clear divisions of enemy and friend. Yet the disappearance of a small dog, nameless on any roster, unraveled that certainty thread by thread. For the first time in months, both sides felt the same thing. Something was wrong. By the next morning, rumors had matured into something sharper, accusations with teeth. The camp, usually held together by brittle routines, now felt like a room filled with gas, waiting only for a spark. Men woke already on edge, scanning the yard with the tense impatience of fathers searching for a missing child. Only this child had 4 legs and a habit of softening the hard corners of war. The Germans struck first. 2 guards stormed into the prisoners' work detail, boots crunching through snow that crackled like broken glass. "Where is he?" one demanded, voice ragged with sleepless frustration. "You're hiding him, we know it." His breath fogged the air in sharp bursts, as if anger alone warmed him. The prisoners stiffened, their shovels going still. Some exchanged confused glances, others glared openly, insulted by the accusation. A British sergeant, gaunt, frostbitten, but standing tall, answered with a slow shake of the head. "We haven't seen him. Maybe your men sold him for meat." It was meant as sarcasm, but in a starving winter, sarcasm had a cruel edge. The guards bristled, rifles lifted, not pointed, but rising as if pulled by the tension coiling in the air. Snowflakes drifted between them like hesitant messengers, unsure which side carried the truth. Whispers spread along the barbed wire. The French prisoners muttered that the Germans had grown desperate enough to kill anything edible. The Germans whispered back that the prisoners needed comfort, a distraction, something to pretend they still had control over their lives. And layered beneath it all was the same unspoken fear trickling through both groups. No one had seen tracks, no blood, no sign. Dogs don't vanish without reason. Barbed wire that yesterday had merely marked territory now seemed to pulse like a living thing, each barb catching the light like a spark from a flint. Men paced alongside it, mirroring each other's steps the way enemies sometimes unintentionally resemble friends. Even the officers sensed the shift. Orders were barked more sharply. Inspections became harsher. A single dropped tool could draw a reprimand. The camp felt as if it were breathing faster, preparing itself for something ugly.
What unsettled everyone most was the realization that the thin thread of peace they'd enjoyed, the quiet moments, the shared glances over a wagging tail, had never been peace at all. It had been a pause, a mutual distraction, a fragile illusion held together by a creature too innocent to understand the danger he balanced between them. Now that he was gone, humanity retreated like warmth pulled from a room. By evening, tempers had sharpened into blades. One wrong word, one wrong gesture, and the whole camp could ignite. It ended not with violence, but with something colder, silence. A silence that felt like the breath held before an explosion. The camp had reached the moment everyone feared, the thin point where anger turns sharp enough to pierce reason. 2 guards shouted across the yard. Prisoners answered back with rising heat. Rifle straps tightened, shoulders stiffened. Even the wind seemed to pause, holding its breath as if deciding whether to carry the next shout into violence. Then it came. A single bark, sharp, distant, cutting through the tension like a stone through glass. Every head turned. Rifles froze mid-air. Words half-formed and burning on the tongue dissolved before they could escape. Men stood as still as carved figures, listening, each one wondering whether the sound had been real or imagined. But then it came again, clearer this time, rising from the tree line like a plea. It was him. No one needed confirmation. They recognized the pitch, the rhythm, the desperate edge threaded through it. It wasn't his usual playful bark. There was pain in it, fear, maybe even injury.
Whatever anger had been building in the camp evaporated instantly, replaced by a cold jolt of instinct that bypassed politics entirely. For the first time since the war began, enemy and prisoner looked not at each other, but in the same direction. A German corporal lowered his rifle first, slowly, as if waking from a fever. A British prisoner straightened beside him, eyes fixed on the distant tree line. Their gazes met, not with challenge, but with the startling realization that they felt the same thing, worry. The simple, undeniable worry that something had happened to the only creature who treated them as more than uniforms and numbers. Another bark echoed, muffled by distance. A few guards stepped toward the fence. Several prisoners followed, unthinking. It felt like gravity had shifted, pulling both sides toward the woods. The contrast was almost surreal. Moments earlier they had been ready to spill each other's blood over suspicion. Now every man stood suspended in the same fragile silence, bound together by the unmistakable sound of a friend in distress. The commandant shouted for order, but even his voice sounded thinner, stripped of authority. The men barely heard him. Their attention had been claimed by something purer, something more human than any command could override. Violence had been building like a storm, but the bark, small, wounded, impossible to ignore, cut through it with a force no weapon could match. And suddenly, the war seemed very far away. The first men moved almost without thinking. A German guard stepped toward the gate, scanning the tree line with a hand raised to shield his eyes. Two prisoners drifted after him, their steps hesitant, as if to expect to be shouted back into place. But no orders came. The officers were frozen too, staring, listening, trying to understand how a single bark had unraveled their authority. Another cry rose from the woods, thin and trembling. That was enough. The Germans unlatched the gate. The prisoners exchanged stunned glances, unsure whether this was a trap or a miracle, but their feet moved anyway, drawn toward the forest by something older and simpler than war. Men who yesterday wouldn't share a glance now walked in the same direction with the same hurried urgency, their breath billowing into the icy air like smoke from the same fire. Across the field, a frontline trench stirred. Soldiers who had been watching the camp through binoculars lowered them in confusion. Movement between guards and prisoners usually meant violence or escape attempts, not whatever this was. One young sentry rose above the parapet, helmet catching a sliver of pale winter sun. "What's happening over there?" someone muttered. But then the wind carried a faint, unmistakable sound. A bark, strained, echoing.
Recognition lit the sentry's face. He stood tall, too tall, and cupped his hands to his mouth, shouting across the no-man's land that had swallowed countless men. "Is it the dog?" Every soldier in the trench winced at his recklessness, but none of the German rifles fired. Instead, several guards turned toward the voice. One raised his arm and shouted back, "Ja, we heard him!" The trench went silent. Men blinked at one another, bewildered by how casually the barrier between enemy and ally had been crossed. A corporal hesitated, then climbed halfway up the embankment, peering over the rim. "Where?" he called. A German pointed toward the woods. Another guard shouted a direction. A prisoner added that he had heard the dog earlier near the northern fence. Voices jumped across the frozen distance, overlapping, colliding, forming a strange, fragile bridge of sound. Then, the most surreal thing happened. Guns lowered. Not by command, not by treaty, but by instinct, as if everyone realized at once that raising a weapon would shatter something too rare to risk. Helmets peeked over parapets. Men from both sides stood exposed in the open, their bodies framed against snow and smoke, held together not by orders, but by concern for a limping, frightened animal. "Try the ravine," someone shouted. "He won't go far from water," another answered.
Directions flew between trenches and camp fences like signals in a language older than war. For the first time since arriving at the front, soldiers weren't listening for gunfire. They were listening for pause, for whimpers, for the soft rustle of a creature they had somehow adopted as a collective responsibility. It was bizarre, completely irrational, and yet deeply, profoundly human. A ceasefire had formed, unwritten, unspoken, undeniable, held together by nothing more than affection and the echo of a wounded bark. The search began without formation, without rank, without the rigid lines that normally shaped every movement of war. Men simply walked, Germans in long gray coats, prisoners wrapped in thin blankets, front-line soldiers with mud frozen on their boots. They drifted toward the forest in a loose, uneven cluster, like survivors of the same disaster rather than enemies shaped by different flags. Snow had fallen overnight, soft and thick, smoothing the world into a quiet white canvas. Their boots broke through it with muffled crunches, leaving a trail behind them that made it look as if they were all part of one long column, marching under the same command. Someone spotted tracks first, small, clean impressions in the fresh powder. The dog's size, the dog's pattern. Every man leaned in to see, and for a moment their breath mingled in the same cloud. The sight filled them with relief, but something darker followed. The tracks wavered, then staggered, scuffing sideways, as if the dog had begun to limp. A German kneeling in the snow murmured, "He's hurt." No one challenged his tone. Pain was a universal language now. They followed the prints deeper into the trees. Branches sagged under the weight of snow, brushing their shoulders as they passed. A British prisoner noticed the first drop of blood. He didn't shout, he simply pointed. A small red bead stood out on the white surface, as delicate as an ink blot on a letter. Then another, then another. The men quickened their pace. The forest thickened, narrowing their path until they walked single file. The silence between them wasn't tense anymore, just heavy, like shared worry carried on many backs. Every so often someone called the dog's name, though half the men used a different one. It didn't matter. The sound was gentle, hopeful, trembling. Then they heard it, a whimper, faint but real. They moved as one, pushing through a line of low shrubs dusted in frost. Beyond them lay a shallow ditch carved by melting snow, a narrow wound in the earth, and there, half buried in the cold, was the dog. He struggled as they approached, not from fear, but desperation. His leg was twisted in a cruel snarl of barbed wire, wire meant for men, not for the one creature who crossed borders without understanding them. The metal had sliced into his fur, staining the snow pink. He tried to lift his head, but exhaustion dragged it back down. For a moment, no one moved, not because they didn't know what to do, but because the sight felt unreal, absurd. The war had taught them to expect horror, but not this kind. A loyal, trusting creature trapped by the very machinery built to divide them.
Then fear dissolved, replaced by instinct. A German medic dropped to his knees. An Allied corporal followed, sliding into the ditch to support the dog's trembling body. Another soldier, nationality irrelevant, pulled off his gloves to gently cup the animal's head. Tenderness replaced disbelief. And for a brief, breathless moment, it felt as though saving him mattered more than winning any war. The medic reached the dog first, sliding down the snowy edge of the ditch with a quiet urgency. His uniform, stiff with frost, brushed against the corporal's thin prison coat as the two men knelt side by side, enemy colors blending into the same patch of white. Neither spoke. There was no need. The dog's trembling body said everything. The medic inspected the twisted metal biting into the fur.
His breath caught. "Easy, Junge," he whispered, voice shaking. The corporal steadied the dog's head, murmuring soft reassurances in English that needed no translation. The animal's eyes flicked between them, clouded with pain, but trusting, always trusting. Hands that had loaded rifles, carried stretchers through shell fire, and obeyed orders that hardened the heart, now hovered with a gentleness almost sacred. The medic pulled a small knife from his satchel. The corporal held the wire taut. Their gloves, clumsy and cold, stained quickly with blood. Enemy blood, dog blood, the distinction meaningless. The wire resisted at first, refusing to surrender its grip. The medic's jaw tightened. "Hold him," he said, not as a command, but as a plea. The corporal nodded, pressing his forehead briefly against the dog's to steady both of them. Snowflakes clung to their eyelashes like fragile ornaments as they worked. With a final snap, the wire gave way. The dog whimpered, a sound so small it silenced the forest. The corporal exhaled shakily, cradling the freed leg. The medic pressed cloth to the wound, his movements tender, practiced, almost parental. Around them, soldiers from both sides stood in a loose circle, helpless witnesses to a miracle they didn't fully understand. The war seemed to pause, watching. A German officer removed his coat without hesitation and handed it down. "Wrap him," he said quietly. A British sergeant stepped forward, adjusting the folds so the dog's head remained exposed to the cold air, but the rest of his body warmed under the heavy wool. The dog's tail thumped once, weak but unmistakable. That single motion cut through every man present like a beam of light. It was gratitude, forgiveness, and recognition in one fragile gesture. For a heartbeat, they were not soldiers, not enemies, just men grateful that something good had survived the night. The medic brushed the dog's muzzle with the back of his fingers. "He's tougher than all of us," he murmured. The medic gave a small, exhausted laugh. "Yeah, a real soldier." But it was more than that. Every man felt it, though none dared say it aloud. The dog wasn't just a companion, he was a mirror, a reminder of who they had been before uniforms carved borders across their lives. In saving him, they had salvaged a piece of themselves, something soft, human, terribly vulnerable, something the war had tried to bury. As they lifted the dog together, their hands met beneath his small, trembling weight, and in that shared burden, they found a truth the war had never intended them to discover. They were still capable of mercy. The march back to the lines felt nothing like the walk into the forest. There was no urgency now, no frantic scanning of footprints, no voices calling into the trees. Instead, the world seemed to exhale, settling into a silence so deep it felt sacred. Snow fell in slow, drifting spirals, as if even the sky understood the moment required gentleness. At the center of the group, wrapped in the heavy coat, the dog lay curled against the corporal's chest, his breath shallow but steady. Each rise and fall of his small body seemed to guide the pace of the men around him. They walked carefully, deliberately, as though any sudden movement might break the fragile peace that had settled over the forest. Germans walked on one side, prisoners and frontline soldiers on the other. The space between them remained, 2 or 3 quiet meters, but it no longer felt hostile. It felt ceremonial, like an unspoken agreement to honor the strange unity that had brought them together. No rifles were raised, no orders barked. Every bootstep fell with the same soft caution, muffled by snow. A British soldier glanced across the gap at a German private. For a moment, their eyes met. Both quickly looked away, not out of shame, but because the connection felt too raw, too honest for the world they were supposed to inhabit. The war had not ended, but for these few minutes, it had stepped aside. Behind them, the ditch and the barbed wire faded into the trees. Ahead, the gray shapes of the trenches and camp emerged, but even those looked different, softened by distance and the unusual stillness. Men in the trenches stopped what they were doing, lifting their heads as the group approached. No one called out, no one demanded explanations. They simply watched, hushed, reverent.
It felt less like returning from a forest and more like leaving a chapel. By the time they reached the dividing line, camp to the right, trenches to the left, the silence had settled into something unbreakable. Not fear, not tension, something gentler. A shared understanding that, for reasons none of them could fully articulate, this moment mattered. A wounded dog had been carried home, and the war, for once, had not dared to interrupt. The next morning, the war returned as if offended by the quiet that had settled over its domain. Artillery rolled in from the horizon, booming with renewed hostility. Rifles cracked, orders barked. The world snapped back into the shape it had carved for itself, cold, obedient, merciless. It was as though the battlefield, embarrassed by its own softness, tried to drown yesterday beneath noise and smoke. Yet the men who had walked into the forest carried something the war couldn't touch. They moved differently, subtly, almost imperceptibly, but enough that others noticed. A German guard hesitated before shouting at a prisoner. An Allied sergeant paused before pursing the sky. Men who once saw only enemies now found themselves remembering hands working together in the snow, voices calling across no man's land. The gentle weight of a wounded dog passed between soldiers who should have hated each other. The dog lay recovering in the camp infirmary, bandaged and drowsy, unaware of the strange ache he had left behind in the hearts of hardened men. They visited him quietly, each at different times, as though afraid of admitting aloud what his rescue had stirred within them. It wasn't peace. The world was nowhere near that merciful. But it was something smaller, and perhaps more honest. A reminder that even in a place designed to grind compassion into dust, humanity could still break through the barbed wire when given the smallest chance. The guns thundered, the smoke thickened, the front lines swallowed another day. But the memory lingered. Enemy and prisoner kneeling side by side in fallen snow. Hands trained to kill, trembling instead to save. A coat wrapped around a frightened body. A silence deeper than fear. In a war where millions died unseen, peace had appeared not through treaties or speeches, but through a single lost dog and the hearts that refused to let him die alone.